Thank you, Corey. Much appreciated. And our next speaker is also our host here at Leiden University, and I want to thank him very much for all the help he's giving me over the course of organizing this. He'll be Thijs Porck, and he'll be speaking. His title is "Seeing the Boars for the Trees," J.R.R. Tolkien's translation and adaptation of the Old English Exodus. Please welcome Thijs Porck.
So it's no secret that when you're a book publisher and you want your books to sell, you put the name of J.R.R. Tolkien on your book, right? Because this will ensure that it will sell and that there will be many reprints. Now, today I'll be talking about this book, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's edition and translation of the Old English Exodus, which was published in only one print round, 3,000 copies. And that's it. So, it's mine. And so it's a rather unique book in the Tolkien oeuvre. I think it might be the worst-selling Tolkien book that I'll be talking about. And it's worth selling for good reasons. But it is still worth studying, as I hope to show you today. I've changed my title somewhat. I wanted to make a pun, and so seeing the boarcrest through the trees, Tolkien's translation and edition of the Old English Exodus. I'll be talking about how he went about translating this Old English text, early medieval English text. So along the way you'll learn a bit more about what Old English is, how, according to Tolkien, you should translate Old English. There will be some links to René's paper, and I hope to show you that this is, in fact, a book worth buying if there are still any copies left of the 3,000. So, on we go. We've already heard a bit about translation today, which was, of course, the theme of today's conference. And René has talked about the Red Book of Westmarch, right? The idea that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion are all part of a translation of the Red Book of Westmarch. That idea of having a book that needed to be translated was there before the Red Book. It's there at the very start of Tolkien's Legendarium. Before the Red Book, there was the Golden Book, which has many names. The Golden Book, the Book of Tavrobel, the Book of Lost Tales, and so on and so forth. Now, this book, and Tolkien kept changing his mind, but the general gist was that an Anglo-Saxon man, an inhabitant of early medieval England, sailed west and ended up in what would become Valinor, and heard all sorts of stories by elves, and then went back to England, and from memory he translated these tales into Old English, early medieval English. And that would then be the Golden Book of, in some cases, the Golden Book of Heorenda, being the Book of Tales of Tavrobel, written by one Heorenda of High Woodle. Some of my students here might recognize the name Heorenda as deriving from the Old English poem Deor. Deor is a lovely Old English poem where a poet, among other things, complains about having been replaced by a better poet. And that better poet is called Heorenda. Well, we don't know what Heorenda wrote, but according to at least one version by Tolkien, he wrote the Golden Book of Heorenda, which featured then the Silmarillion and all that, all those stories. In one guise, Heorenda is the son of Ælfwine, sometimes called Eriol, an Anglo-Saxon who ended up in the elvish lands of the West. In other versions of the tale, it is Ælfwine himself who composes these Old English legends of the Valar and what have you. And this is why, in some volumes of history of Middle-earth, we actually have real Old English texts, like these Old English Annals of Valinor, translated by Ælfwine into Old English. And in my third year course in Old English literature, my students have to translate this text. It's a lot of fun. So we learn about Morgoth killing the beams and then fleeing away, right? Her osloch Morgoth va Bernas and Offler. and so on and so forth. This idea of translating Old English also recurs elsewhere in Tolkien's Legendarium. In his time travel novel, or attempt at writing a time travel book, Lost Road, the main character, Alwyn, has various linguistic dreams. He dreams, and then when he wakes up, he remembers the songs that were sung to him. And some of these songs are in Old English, and here is a lovely Old English poem that Tolkien composed, and then we get a translation as well. One other dream of Alwyn in what he calls Eresion gives us an idea of how Alwyn went about translating his text. So at some point, he's had this dream. The next day, he can't fall asleep. It's the dead of night, and he can't fall asleep because he keeps on thinking about his translation and on how to translate some of these words. And we can see that he's made a transcription of sorts and then gives translations of every word, word for word translation. Right? And then we see the main character thinking about some of these words. What was Atalante? It seemed to mean ruin or downfall, but also to be a name. Right? This is Tolkien's sort of attempt at getting Atlantis into his Legendarium as well. So translation then plays an important role in Tolkien's fiction, but as René has already told us, Tolkien was also an academic, and in his daily life he did not make his daily bread by writing poems and legends and what have you. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, of Old English, and he worked with old texts, and one of the things that he would do is translate some of these texts. In fact, his first real job was as an assistant of the Oxford English Dictionary, where he was tasked with finding out what certain words meant, how to translate certain words in the history of the English language. Right? So he worked on the etymologies of W words, from waggle to warlock and what have you. And here is his entry for walrus, right, where he sort of gives the old versions of the word, the Germanic cognates, and then he outlines how the word is to be translated. That is what he did for a while. And then, of course, he went to the university and became a professor of Anglo-Saxon. He taught at Leeds, but also at the University of Oxford, where he created various translations of old texts. René has already referred to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Pearl, Sir Orfeo, and of course his Beowulf translation, which I imagine sold more than 3,000 copies because it was sort of hyped in the newspapers and media and what have you. This is an image from the Tolkien exhibition that some of you may have visited in Oxford, or it's now in the US. And we can tell that Tolkien kept on changing his translation as he kept on changing his drafts for all of his fictional work. And so he put a lot of effort into creating translations from Old English into modern English, right? Love me, who you like. Anyway. Anyway. So then we get to his Old English Exodus. This little book that is virtually ignored, according to Tom Shippey, who, of course, is the only one to have actually written one article about the Old English Exodus by Tolkien, because Tom Shippey writes about everything, doesn't he? And so Shippey says, well, by the time his edition of Exodus came out, it was so far away from the academic centre ground, it was so far away from how people looked at Old English texts at the time, that it was virtually ignored. It came out in 1982. And if you read some of the reviews of Tolkien's Exodus, they are quite, shocking to this audience, I imagine. So, Norman Blake says, it might seem that there was a little need for this one. To read it is to be carried back some 30 or more years. Its usefulness may well reside in providing a corrective to some fashionable attitudes and prejudice. In other words, this is how you should not do it, right? Irving says, if Tolkien had not become so renowned as author of the classic Lord of the Rings, we can be certain that this partial edition of Exodus would never have seen the light. It has no sort of reason to exist. But there are some redeeming qualities, and one redeeming quality mentioned by another Olsen is that the translation is a pleasure for the professional Anglo-Saxonists to read, and if it were only published separately, it would have given general readers a taste of the original and suggested them that the poem repays study in Old English and is not merely of antiquarian interest. And so what I want to do is take up this sort of gauntlet that is proposed by Olsen and say that the translation is indeed quite good, and it does give you a taste of the original. It's a foreignizing translation, to use René's term. And it's actually quite good, and it sort of repays to have a look at this translation by Tolkien of the Old English Exodus. So that's what we'll do today. So I'll start by introducing this Old English text. What are we talking about? What is the Old English Exodus? Why would someone like Tolkien be interested in the Old English Exodus? Then we'll briefly talk a bit more about the translation and edition. Then how to translate Old English. As René pointed out, Tolkien wrote a sort of piece on translating Beowulf, how to translate Beowulf. He sort of gives a number of rules, you might say, or a number of tips, and we can see whether he applied those to his translation of the Exodus. That's what we'll do. And then we'll briefly talk about what to do if you can't translate the source text. In the case of Tolkien and his Old English Exodus, you simply change the source text. And then that will allow you to provide some sort of translation. That, of course, is what philology is all about, and so we'll talk about that as well. So, let's talk then about the Old English Exodus, which survives, as many Old English poems do, in only one manuscript, Oxford Bodleian Library, manuscript Junius 11. It is known as the Junius manuscript, but it's also known as the Catman manuscript. Now, some of you may know who Catman is. The father of English poetry. He is a shepherd that, according to the story by Bede, he is at an Anglo-Saxon karaoke party. They're passing the harp. Everyone sings to the harp. But when the harp comes to Catman, he is afraid. And he retreats to the stables where he falls asleep. And he has a linguistic dream, like Albuin in The Lost Road. An angel comes to him and he says, "Sing me what hugu, sing me something." And Catman says, "What shall I sing on? What must I sing?" And the angel says, "Sing me Frumschaft, sing me about creation." And then Catman starts to sing. "Nu shall on herion heaven reaches word, one goodness word," etc. I use etc. there wisely, I think. And then we're told by Bede that Catman then goes to a monastery where the monks tell him biblical tales. And Catman chews on these tales, he ruminates on these tales, and out comes poetry. And so Catman must have composed many Old English poems dealing with biblical tales. And then they found the Junius manuscript, which contains Old English versions of biblical books. Genesis, Exodus, Daniel, and a poem about Christ and Satan. Surely this must have been written by Catman. It was not. But there you go. Someone who certainly thought that it was written by Catman, and who also lent his name to the manuscript, was Francis Junius, the Younger. And since we're in Leiden, I would like to point out that he was a student of Leiden, and so the Junius manuscript is ours. To some degree, anyway. So he was a student of theology at Leiden, but he became a pioneer of Germanic philology. He was the one to make the first edition of the Gothic Bible, for instance. And he produced the first edition of the Junius manuscript, which, as you can see, he assigned to a guy called Cadman. Now, the Junius manuscript is fascinating. It has beautiful poetry. It also has illustrations. So this is what happens with Adam and Eve. Right, you can see them face palm over what they've done over there. Now, one of the drawings in the Junius manuscript would have caught the attention of Tolkien. It is found on page 2, where there's a roundel of a young man depicted. And we're not quite sure who this young man is. Is he the poet? Is he the patron of the book? But we do know his name, Alf Wiener. Alf Wiener, right? The same name as the Anglo-Saxon who supposedly ended up in the lands to the west. In the Junius manuscript, then, we find our Old English Exodus, a relatively brief poem, just 590 lines. It's a verse retelling of Exodus, the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. Right? It's a migration story. As many of you will be aware, Tolkien was also very interested in these migration stories. Right? Think of the elves leaving Valinor and all that, and the Rohirrim coming from somewhere else, and the hobbits being led by two brothers to another place, and so on. What makes Exodus an interesting poem is its combination of Germanic heroic tradition and Christian patristic thought. Right? So it's a biblical tale, but we have lots of features of Germanic heroism there as well. Tolkien would also have been interested in the Old English Exodus because it has a link, or so people thought, with Beowulf. There are certain words that they have in common, certain phrases that they have in common, and they would both be very old poems. They were both thought to be very old poems. Here is the opening lines, and that should, for those of you who know Beowulf, sound somewhat familiar. It starts with Chwat, we fer on neer gefriegen habath over middenjaard Moses domas, which Tolkien translates as, "Lo, we've heard how near and far over Middle-earth Moses declared his ordinances to men." Right? Chwat, we gardina in eerdachum theod kuninga through me fruno, hu tha athalingas ellen fremedon. Those are the opening lines of Beowulf, and you can see how it is somehow similar. We'll return to this passage later on. So, we also see how the Germanic heroic tradition has sort of influenced the portrayal in the Old English Exodus of someone like Moses, who is depicted as a leader of men, a leader of the host, a valiant captain of his folk. Right? This is Moses as a hero, almost as heroic as this guy in the big feature film. There are also various fighting scenes, and there's lots of military vocabulary that is used in this poem, and even the Egyptians dying in the Red Sea is described in, sort of, as a battle. Right? The sea loudly threatened death, the sea as an opponent who sort of attacks these Egyptians. And some of you may be reminded of this scene from Lord of the Rings, right? With another sort of watery, aquatic opponent that strikes down the Dark Riders and so on. Let's then go back to Tolkien's Old English Exodus. This is based on his lecture notes from the 1930s and 1940s. He started lecturing on the Old English Exodus in 1926, and so he sort of kept this up for at least 20 years, say. What we have then are his notes, and one of his former students, John Turville Peter, made these notes into what we now have, a little book with an edition, translation, and commentary. Now, having to form those notes into a little book must not have been a nice experience. Bruce Mitchell, who was another former student of Tolkien's, described his lectures as follows: like a badly presented and served cordon bleu meal. Right? So, and Tolkien, of course, is famous for having talked in footnotes during his lectures. And so we can only imagine how horrible the event, the look of his lecture notes must have been, constantly rewritten and so on and so forth. Now, you've seen already that the edition was sort of panned by the critics. There is no need for this. Why do we even have this book? But there was one redeeming quality, and that was the quality of the translation. So again, the translation is a pleasure to read. In the Tolkien Encyclopedia, there is a short, brief entry about the edition of Exodus, where again, we're taught that the translation is not only good in its prose, but also renders the original in creative and fascinating ways, giving the reader a genuine feel of the original. And so what I want to talk about is how Tolkien did that. How does he give you that genuine feel? How does he translate this Old English text? And in order to do so, what I want to do is not talk about Nida and domesticating and foreignizing and what have you, all of these translation theories that we've already heard about. Instead, I want to look at Tolkien's own ideas about translating Old English, in this case, his thoughts about translating Beowulf, see what he says about how he thought that Beowulf was supposed to be translated, and then sort of see what he does in the Old English Exodus. And then hopefully we'll see that he does everything according to his own rules. Of course he doesn't, but there you go. So I'll be comparing what he says about translating Beowulf to the Old English Exodus, and every now and then I'll also make a reference to another translation of Exodus by Bradley, just to give a contrast and give you an idea of what Tolkien does, how his translation might be better than Bradley's. Okay. Before I start, though, Tolkien does say that you can't just rely on a translation, that translation is only an aid to study. A good translation is a good companion of honest labour. What you should really do is study the original. Right? The essential work with grammar and glossary by which alone can be won genuine appreciation of a noble idiom and a lofty art. And so do not only read translations, also look at the originals. A point that I might echo from Jonas' paper this morning. Hooray. So, one of the first things that Tolkien says about translation, and many of the things that he says have to do with lexical choice. What sort of words do you use to translate certain words in the original? And one thing he says is, if the original text has a recurring word, then you should perhaps try and translate each recurrence in the same way, because the recurrence of the word may be significant. Tolkien, talking about Beowulf, gives the example of Eaken, which means broad, huge, mighty, which is used multiple times in the Old English poem, and it serves to link Beowulf's strength to a magical sword and to the dragon's hoard. They're all sort of magically enlarged, the strength, the sword, and the hoard. And if you don't translate that word in the same way in your translation, then that link is sort of missed. I thought this was an interesting point, and I thought, well, let's see what Tolkien does himself. And so I looked at the word moldy, which can have many meanings, which is applied in Exodus to Moses, to God, to the Israelites, and to the sea. Right? Linking, say, the good guys, Moses, Israelites, and God, to the Red Sea, also a good guy, as it were. And there are translations where each of these occurrences is rendered as brave. So the Red Sea as being brave. I thought that's a nice idea, I thought. Sadly, Tolkien did not live up to his own sort of element, because he gives different translations for each of the occurrences. So in that sense, then, Tolkien's translation is not perfect yet. Right? Of course, he was working on it still. And like his Beowulf translation, this one was probably never intended to be published. Although he did have plans to publish an edition and translation of the Old English Exodus. Right. Another thing, another element of translating Old English that Tolkien refers to is word order and style. He says, personally, you may not like an archaic vocabulary and word order, artificially maintained as an elevated literary language. You may prefer the brand new, the lively and the snappy. But he says, well, you shouldn't use that because Old English poetry, like Beowulf, but also like Exodus, uses a sort of archaic, literary, artificial sort of language. There are many words in Old English poetry that are only there in Old English poetry, which are archaic words. And so if you translate something like Beowulf or Exodus, you need to sort of give it an archaic feel. And that's certainly what Tolkien does if we look at his opening lines. Right? Lo, let him hearken who will. Right? That's not lively and snappy. That is archaic, artificial. Right? Moving swiftly on. Tolkien also talks about other lexical choices that you can make as an author. And he says he sort of prefers the sober, sort of native words over frivolous words like hitting and whacking. Instead of hitting and whacking, you should use striking and smiting. You should not use talk and chat, but you should use speech and discourse. Do not talk about exquisite and artistic, but talk about cunning craft and skill. Don't talk about visitors, which, according to Tolkien, sort of gives the impression of teas and cookies and biscuits. Instead, you should talk about guests. Do not talk about well-bred, brilliant, polite noblemen, but talk about worthy, brave, and courteous men. Right? So the lexical choice that you use is important, perhaps to sort of get that foreignizing, archaic feel. And so if we compare two passages, one from Bradley's translation and one from Tolkien's translation, we can see how Tolkien's translation sort of differs from what might be considered a sort of standard translation. This is about the death of the firstborn in Egypt, one of the 10 plagues. And you haven't got time to read all of this out, but I will give you the words that sort of are not native and are frivolous in Bradley's translation, and then we can compare those to what Tolkien does. Right? So Bradley says, the lamentation was incessant, and Tolkien says, the lamentation was renewed. The pleasures of her life, plundered of wealth, languished. And Tolkien says, mirth was hushed in the halls bereft of treasure. We have submission in Bradley's translation, and we have crushed in Tolkien's translation. We have an implacable public foe, but we have someone grievously afflicting the people in Tolkien's translation. We've got worldly delight, and the hands of the deriders were stayed. And Tolkien has the merriment of men and the makers of mirth. Right? You can see how Tolkien uses more sort of native, simple, perhaps more archaic words like mirth and what have you, and avoids words like delight and pleasure. Other elements of diction that Tolkien discusses include etymological fallacy, so replacing, say, the word beam with beam. It doesn't mean the same anymore, right? Beam in Old English might mean tree, pillar, beam now, of course, is a beam of light, and so on. As René already mentioned, translating Old English is not a context where you can sort of exhume dead words from Saxon or Norse graves. You shouldn't use completely archaic dead words. Right? Don't resurrect words. It's a nice sort of thought. And Tolkien also discusses the use of synonyms. One peculiar feature of Old English poetry is that the poets use various synonyms. There are 25 words for man, 80 words for warrior, and so on. And of course, modern English does not have the same amount of synonyms anymore. And so what should you do as a translator? Well, Tolkien says, we have to be content with less variation. The total effect is not much change. Our ears, unaccustomed to the kind of synonyms that we get in Old English poetry, may be as much impressed by less. He does say that you can use words like knights and princes, even though they conjure up images of King Arthur and so on when you translate Beowulf. And you should prefer those words over warrior and chief, because that might give you the impression of Zulus and Red Indians, something he could no longer write today, I think. Right? So there's no reason for avoiding knights, esquires, courts, and princes, but you should perhaps be wary of too many warriors and chiefs. And so I looked at his Old English Exodus and had a go at finding out what sort of words he uses to refer to men, warriors, armies, troops, chiefs, and what have you. And this is a list. And so you can see that he indeed does not vary all that much. He mostly uses man, or men. He uses host, people, company, folk. Then there are 12 warriors, but there are 10 princes. He uses army 11 times, captain, kinsman, chief, only 3, and only 1 knights. So there is indeed less variation, but at least there's not a sort of a host of chiefs and warriors there. Another element of diction that Tolkien touches upon, and Renee also touched on this, kennings, right? These extended metaphors. Words like gleobeam, glee beam, if you want to be etymologically, or if you want to fall prey to the etymological fallacy, right? It actually means mirthwood, wood that makes you happy. Of course, that's a harp. And Tolkien says, well, the translator dealing with these compounded words, these kennings, must hesitate between simply naming the thing denoted, so saying harp for gomenwudu, playwood, and resolving the combination into a phrase. The former retains the compactness of the original, but loses its colour. The latter retains the colour, but even if it does not falsify or exaggerate it, it loses and weakens the texture. Choice between evils will vary with occasions. And so what I've tried to do is look at how Tolkien himself deals with the kennings in the Old English Exodus. And so there's the lovely kenning laughter smiths, people who create laughter. Harp players. In one of Tolkien's explanatory notes, he says this is like a harp player striking his harp, like a smith strikes the anvil. And Tolkien says makers of mirth. That's quite decent. Heaven candle, heaven candle, which is the sun. And Tolkien says the torch of heaven, which is quite good. Then we have Barnhus's word, Bonehouse's guardian. The Barnhouse is the house of your bones, that is your body. And the guardian of your body is, of course, your soul. And so, what you should have is something like the body's guardian or the soul. What Tolkien says is the ruler of the body's house, which is, in fact, a not very accurate translation. Right? Barnhouse itself is body. Body's house is something else. So why does he say body's house? Well, this has to do with what the poem does, with the context of the poem. As Tolkien says, if you have to translate these kennings, you need to look at the context, and your choices may vary. Now, in this case, Tolkien decided to keep that reference to house, because in the context, the poem uses to unlock, unlockon, and cachon, keys. And so, in Tolkien's own translation, the entire sentence reads as follows. The ruler of the body's house, the soul, will with spiritual keys unlock the lavish good stored there in the scripture. So we see that he actually bases his choices on context and what have you. Other poetic elements that Tolkien discusses include meter and alliteration. As those of you who've followed a course in Old English know, Old English poetry has half lines. There are certain patterns. I've heard sievers being mentioned at some point, right? Metaphorical patterns, and Old English poetry alliterates. If you have never read Old English poetry, but you have read The Lord of the Rings, then you have indeed come across some Old English poetry. Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden. Dire deeds awake, dark is it eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. Fourth Eolingus. This is Anglo-Saxon Old English poetry. Rise, rise, riders. Dire deeds dark. horse, horn. Right? There is alliteration, we have sort of short metrical half-lines, and so on. And Tolkien says, one of the things he says, and one of the things that is reflected in his translation, that gives it this sort of authentic feel, is that because of these metrical patterns, all these poets avoid extra syllables. Syllables that didn't fall inside a pattern were avoided. And one of the reasons, this is one of the reasons for the frequent asyndeton, that is, short phrases like dire deeds awake, dark is it eastward, let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. They are short phrases without conjunctions, right? Without and or but or what have you. And the love of short parallel sentences that mark the style. And if you read some of the passages in Tolkien's Old English poetry, Old English Exodus, we can see that he sort of kept some of these features. For instance, we have the short parallel sentences. In the host was filled with fear. The terror of waters fell upon souls accursed. The sea loudly threatened death. The rock cliffs were drenched with blood. The deep foamed with gore. Cries were amid the waves. The water was filled with weapons. A deadly mist arose. Back were the Egyptian throne. They fled in fear. Look, short sentences, right? A syndeton. These short sentences that are not linked with and or but and what have you. And this, of course, is how the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea. Here's another passage describing that same sort of event, Egyptians drowning in the sea. And we can see alliteration, that in some passages of the Old English Exodus, Tolkien sort of retains this alliteration as a sort of foreignizing element. A roaring uprose high unto the heavens, the greatest of battle cries. The hated people wailed with voices doomed. Dark grew the air above. The flood was driven with blood. Rent were the ramparts. The sky lashed down the direst of drowning deaths. They perished in their pride, kings in company. Note how all of this alliterates, right? King's company, perished pride, and so on. Fettered fast, failing of its landing, snared and trapped. So, right. So, to return then to why is this translation so pleasurable? Why is it, how does it give us this authentic feel? Well, we can say this taste of the original derives from, in part, its archaic style, the lexical choices that Tolkien makes, his sort of preference for sober native words, his dealings with kennings, usually they are retained in some form or rot. There is this retention of the short parallel sentences, and there's also retention of alliteration. Now, I tried to make a pun with my title, and that's what the last 3 minutes or so of this talk are going to be about. So I told you that the edition was panned, especially by someone called Lucas, who had made a new modern edition of Exodus and didn't really like Tolkien's edition that came out. Tolkien mostly got it wrong. As an editor, Tolkien emerged as an inveterate meddler who occasionally had bright ideas. Right? What reviewers did not like about Tolkien's edition was the fact that Tolkien meddled with the text. Tolkien was convinced that the guy who copied the Old English Exodus into the Jewish manuscript had made lots of mistakes and lots of blunders. And he, whenever he could not translate some lines in the Old English Exodus, he decided, well, in that case, the original must be wrong, and we must change the original. So he says, well, it abounds in omissions, it blunders over common words. There's no excuse for this. Here's one example where he was right. So in the manuscript we see feonda, folkrift. The scribe accidentally copied the same word twice. And Tolkien said, well, you should only have copied it once. Elsewhere, Tolkien talks about the scribe in these terms: nonsense, nonsensical. This is nonsense. What it says in the manuscript does not make sense to me, therefore it is nonsense, we must change it. And one passage in which he does this, and in which he does something quite interesting, and that might also have a link to his fiction, is in this passage, which describes how the Israelites see the army of the Pharaoh going forth, overholdweggen, moving or carrying over the forest, the cavalry shining. This does not make sense. How does an army move over a forest? How does it carry over a forest? What are forests doing in Egypt? Right? So, what's this all about? And various editors have been struck by this passage and came up with various solutions. I think that Tolkien's solution is best, but I'll give you some of the others. So according to Kluge, it's not overholdweggen, it is overholdweggen. That is, over the forest ways. According to Sedgefield, it is overholt, a forest of spears which rises over the heads of those who bear them. Right? So over, and then a forest of spears. And weggen is then moving. According to Krapp, that is his real name, overhold means over wood and therefore the wooden covering of a shield. So they're carrying shields. According to Lucas, 1977, it's in fact everholdweggen, everhold being boar, spear, and then hold doesn't mean forest anymore, but spear. But this is what Tolkien does. He says, this is his translation, when they saw from the southward ways the arm of Pharaoh marching on their crests like a forest moving, their cavalry shining. He says, overhold, the holt is a reference indeed to a forest of spears, but over is probably an error for Eivor. Eivor is the Old English word for boar. A holt was the right place to look for boars. Eivor Shalom Holte, the boar must be in the forest. But the boars in this thicket were not boar spears, but they're boar crests. And the forest was moving. So what Tolkien imagined was something like this. These are depictions of early medieval warriors with boar crests on their helmets. And so they're marching, this Egyptian army, with their spears. That is the forest. And there are boars on their helmets. And those are the forest of boars, right? The boar crest. Now, I was struck by this commentary, by this note by Tolkien. Of course, I was reminded of another forest moving. Right? Pippin looked behind. The number of the Ents had grown, or what was happening. Were the dim bare slopes that they had crossed shoot line? He thought he saw groves of trees, right? But they were moving. Could it be that the trees of Fangorn were awake, and the forest was rising, marching over the hills to war? A forest that was moving. I think there's a link. There's certainly a link with what happens to Folka, one of the kings of the Rohirrim, who goes to Everhold, which is the boar wood where he is killed by a boar. Right? That word, Everhold, had a hold on Tolkien. Right, so we conclude. There'll be room for questions during the Q&A. Right? So Tolkien's translation edition of the Old English Exodus is well worth studying. It's a translation that provides us with a taste of the original, and we've seen how he does that. His editorial meddling shows his philological imagination. Some of the sort of emendations that he comes up with are very sort of inspired. And it may be one more source of inspiration for his fiction, with this forest moving. Now, I'll conclude with an image, and I understand that Corey will be talking about the movie adaptations. There's at least one thing that the movie adaptation of The Hobbit got wrong, and that is, you should not ride on a boar, but the boar should be on top of you instead. Right, on that note, thank you.